Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Multiracial Experiences in Higher Ed author webinar. My name is Patty Webb, and I'm the Marketing Manager for Stylus Publishing. Stylus webinars bring you direct access to our authors and their latest titles. Today, I'm happy to introduce Marc P. Johnston-Guerrero and Charmaine L. Wijeyesinghe, editors of Multiracial Experiences in Higher Education, Contesting Knowledge, Honoring Voice, and Innovating Practice. This book came out in February 2021 with Stylus. Joining our panel will be book chapter authors Nick Davis, Chelsea Guillermo-Wann, and Max Pereyra. So without further ado, I will pass the mic to Charmaine.
Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're tuning in from. We're so excited to have you join us here today. Before we talk, I'm just going to ask each presenter to say maybe a few words about who you are. I'm sure, as Patty said, I'm Charmaine Wijeyesinghe. I'm an author and consultant who lives right outside of Albany, New York, and I explore issues of racial identity, intersectionality, and social justice in both my consulting practice and my publications, and I use she, her, and hers pronouns. I'm going to pass that to Marc now.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Charmaine. My name is Marc Johnston-Guerrero. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm a faculty member at The Ohio State University in our Higher Ed and Student Affairs program. And I study race and racism in higher ed with a specific focus on multiraciality. And I will turn it over to Max.
Hello, everyone. My name is Max Sprea. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a PhD student at UCLA. I'm really happy to be here and talk with you all. My research looks at race and racism in higher education, as well as sexual violence prevention, education, and response. Yeah, do I popcorn it or are you gonna guide it, Marc? Okay, I'll popcorn to Chelsea.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chelsea Guillermo-Wann, and I'm an author, educator, and consultant outside of the Los Angeles area in California. And I'm also a parent of young children, which has been an identity that has become salient, especially in the last 2 years, navigating professional and personal responsibilities. So a shout out to fellow parents who might be tuning in today. And my work has spanned different segments of education. I've actually spent my most recent maybe 6 or 7 years in K-12 school district leadership, which has been a great learning experience and a new lens and frame to reflect upon practice and leadership and education in post-secondary higher ed spaces. So that's a little bit about me, and I'm really excited to be here. I also just want to acknowledge the land that I'm on. It's the native land is the Chumash, and so I just want to acknowledge the Indigenous community from my area, and that I am a guest here. I will hand it over to Nick.
Thanks for that, Chelsea. Hey everyone, so my name is Nick Davis. I use he, him pronouns. I'm based out of Chicago on the historic lands of the Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi peoples. I've done a lot of things, but right now I'm doing community engagement for the Lieutenant Governor of Illinois, heading up the state of Illinois' agriculture, equity, and food insecurity initiatives to support Black and brown farmers and make sure that the communities throughout Illinois that are most affected by food insecurity are fed. So not so much in the research space as much, but have spent a lot of time in the multiracial and mixed race student identity development space. And so I really appreciate this this invitation to speak. And I think that rounds out the speakers, is that right? Okay, so I'll pass it back over to Charmaine.
Great, thanks everybody, and thank you all for attending and joining us here. We are seeing people pop up, and we can see that you're coming from all different areas of the country and from all different roles. We're so excited to have you here. Before we jump into the sort of the heart of the presentation, I'll just talk a bit about the book. The book really is an intergenerational collaboration between diverse multiracial people exploring different aspects of multiracial experiences in higher education. The contributors represent a range of ancestries and chosen racial identities and other social positions like gender, sexual orientation, age, and economic position. And also the types of institutions where they work and the types of institutions they attended as undergrads and graduate students. The book is divided into three main sections. The first section touches on research, theory, and concepts that are informed by and informed with multiracial research and experiences in higher education. The second section of the book contains several narratives from multiracial people who, again, represent a range of identities, and actually the narratives use diverse forms in their presentation. And the book concludes with a third section about tools and strategies for enhancing inclusion of multiracial people in higher education. Today's program will highlight a chapter from each of those three sections. Briefly, in terms of context setting for this session and for the book, we were really fortunate to have the foreword of the book authored by G. Reginald Daniel. Some of you may know of his work. In that foreword, he grounds the discussion of multiracial experiences in the historical legacy of monoracial imperatives and laws and practices based on the hyperdescent model. This foreword really unveils how multiracial people, their identities, and their scholarship contest long-held beliefs and practices regarding race and equity on college campuses. And the themes that Reg introduces in the foreword resonate throughout the book. In the early sections of the book, in the preface and introduction, Mark and I illustrate how multiracial experiences in higher education are influenced by the passage of time and evolving social, political, and cultural norms. And we do this in a number of ways. We tell parts of our own stories. We cite some census data that was before the 2020 census to kind of outline who multiracial people are in higher education. And I think lastly, we acknowledge the messiness, the complexities, and really the imperfections of language and concepts, and even the future visions that the book offers by, through the different contributors. So we hope you engage with the book and engage with us here during the session. As we move through the body of the program, we'll display the chapters for each section, and one of those chapters will be highlighted, and that will note the chapter by the contributor who's speaking with us today. At the end, we will take some questions. Please post questions through the Q&A function. Some folks may use the chat if you'd like. I personally don't respond to things during chats, during programs. So if you have a question for me, please put it in the Q&A, and we will be pulling questions directly from the Q&A function at the end of the program. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Mark to show the slide that represents the chapters from the first section of the book, and turn the mic over to Max.
All righty. Well, it's a pleasure to be able to be here. Like I said, my name is Max. Mark, if you could turn, there you go. Yeah, like I said, it's really great to be here. I'm joining you all from the land of the Gabrielino Tongva people here in Los Angeles. As I mentioned, my research has to do with race and racism on college campuses and also campus sexual violence. And so in the spirit of being trauma informed, I do want to let you all know that we are going to be talking about some difficult topics, including things related to white supremacy, racism, racialization. And so I encourage you all, when possible, to try and check in with yourselves. And if you need to tune out to me talking at any point, you won't hurt my feelings, I promise. Okay. So to get us started, the book chapter that I co-authored with Mark, who's here with us, as well as Jessica Harris from UCLA, is on this topic called monoracism. So Mark, if you could go to the next slide. And so kind of as a roadmap of what I'm going to talk about in the next 9 minutes that I have with you is thinking about, one, building off of, as Charmaine was talking about, what Dr. Daniel talks about in the foreword, which is that historical context that shapes our present engagement with this idea of race and racism. And then I'm not going to go too much into some of the tensions that we tried to navigate in this chapter, but I will allude to them a little bit. And I think I'll conclude by talking about kind of some of my hopes and aspirations and dreams, if you will, of what I hope people take away from this work that we've been able to work on. So, so starting with that historical context about monoracism, and I know I haven't offered you a definition yet, but just to set kind of the stage on where we're thinking about this. And this is something that I kind of wish we had talked a little bit more about in the chapter, is this idea of race and how we conceptualize it is very much shaped by the last 500 years of history. It's a project of white supremacy, and it is for the purposes of, sorry, I get distracted by chats too. It's for the purposes of upholding systems of domination. So when we think about, no, don't worry about it. When we think about this idea of racial purity, or this idea that there are unique categories of races, that's a fairly recent phenomenon. And it goes back to the first contact of Europeans with indigenous peoples of the Americas and questioning their humanity. It goes to the racialization of enslaved Africans and African Americans, and the need to racialize them regardless of their ancestry as Black for the purposes of upholding that economic system. And when we also think about it in the context of the university, scholars have been engaging with this essentialist notion of biological race for a very long time. If you look at the writings of Thomas Jefferson, and he talks about like the inherent inferiority of African Americans, and that sentiment continues well into the eugenics movement of the 20th century. It continues into like phrenology, and in the educational context, psychometrics, trying to find the scientific classification of race. And so I think it's important that we situate ourselves not just within the, our own identities and with the land that we're on, but also within the time frame that we live in. And so thinking about how, even though we're engaging with this idea of race and racism and monorace and multiraciality, these are all constructs that have been inevitably shaped by the needs of the white supremacy and the dominant social groups, right? So kind of moving into the next slide, that historical context being in place, I want to talk about what monoracism is. So scholars have kind of talked about different types of racisms, right? Racist nativism, anti-Blackness. And so I kind of conceptualize, and we talk about this in the book chapter, that monoracism is kind of another form of many racisms, all of which serve to uphold white supremacy. And in the case of this idea of monoracism, I also want to emphasize that we're not the first people to talk about this. The foreword, the author who wrote our foreword, Dr. Daniel, and as well as Chris Wren, and as well as Charmaine, have all written about this well before this concept was introduced, but you may be using different language, right? They're talking about the social context, the social ecology that multiracial people experience, and a lot of the themes that are within that research are talking about this idea of monoracism. Eric Hamako offers the definition that it is the systemic privileging of things, people, and practices that are racialized as single race and or racially pure, and the oppression of things, people, and practices that are racialized as being more than one race. So as I said, that idea of being racially pure, or that there are races at all, or that we can give social meaning to what those categories are, is a socially and culturally constructed thing. And so thinking about that in the context of multiraciality, it's this systemic way in which mixed race people, or people who are perceived as not being racially pure, whether or not they self-identify as mixed race or not, are subjected to this system of monoraciality. And so, Mark, if you could go to the next slide. What our chapter does is it's kind of engaging with, like I said, other scholars have talked about monoracism before, Mark included, But kind of what the chapter, the goal of the chapter is to build off of that scholarship and try and engage with some tension points around this idea of monoracism. So some of the things that we tried to think about were, people have talked about monoracism, but how have we thought about it in the context of other systems of domination? I mentioned that my work also involves sexual violence prevention and response, and we know that on college campuses, mixed race people experience sexual violence at rates that are much higher than other categories. And so no one's really tried to examine then what is the intersection of monoracism with sexuality, with gender, with disability. And so that's kind of one area. Another tension point that we tried to explore was kind of this idea around who can perpetuate monoracism, like what are the mechanisms by which it happens. But without getting too bogged down in that, I think as I was rereading the chapter, I thought that this kind of quotation really summarized well our perspective on monoracism, which is that monoracism is a form of racism that white people and people of color can perpetrate to reconstruct a monoracial only paradigm of race, which upholds white supremacy. The paradigm reinforces monorace as a biological concept that can be rank ordered into a racial hierarchy wherein white is supreme, pure, and inherently deserving of racial privileges. So I think that that part right there that I italicized, it's a paradigm that reinforces monorace as a biological concept. That's a thing that we all do, right? It's a thing that white people do. It's a thing that people of color do. It's a thing that mixed race people do. And so engaging with that paradigm, it's kind of this duality, right? And that's something we talked about too when we were writing the book chapter, is that there's that duality of like, we want to deconstruct this idea of race, but also like race is this very real thing that has material consequences on people and all of us. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't critique the concept to begin with. And so that's kind of what we're thinking about, is how has monorace been constructed in such a way that upholds white supremacy? In my last minute or so, I'll talk about a few examples of monoracism. So, just to kind of illustrate the topic. So for instance, multiracial faculty or student affairs professionals being questioned by people of color about whether or not they were authentic people of color. Whether or not they could talk about issues of race or racism. And those scholars that I've cited there, Jessica Harris, one of our co-authors, and Chris Wren are both great places to look about that. Identity-based organizations excluding mixed race people. Those are all also examples of monoracism. And to conclude, my hope is that reading through this, it might take a couple of reads, I'll be honest. Like, you might see something and you might think like, oh, I don't know, I didn't think of it that way, or I didn't, not quite sure what's meant by that. And it could be very well that we didn't make sense, but more likely, hopefully it's that, we're re-engaging with our assumptions about race, and we're thinking about how has these different identities been constructed for the purpose of upholding white supremacy. And then turning that around and then implementing it in your research, in your practice, in order to try and meet this common goal of dismantling this particular system of domination. That was 9 minutes, 55 seconds. So.
Great, thanks so much, Max. And just, I feel just so lucky and privileged to be able to think so deeply with Max and Dr. Harris, as you mentioned. So, and sometimes that got real theoretical, right? And so as Charmaine mentioned, the different parts of the book, like this is one chapter of a more theoretical and foundation, right? So the whole book is not like that, because we wanted to balance it out and have some story and narrative as well. So our next section, section 2, focuses on narratives and people telling their stories. They take on different forms. Here are all of the chapters that fit that fall into this section. You can see a wide variety of topics, focus points, identities represented, and we thought it would be important to do it by positionality as well in relation to higher education. And so Nick was the more undergrad focus. He was a recent alum, and so we really loved being able to capture his experiences as an undergraduate. And so I will turn it over to him.
Thanks so much for that, Mark, and thanks, Max. That was, I learned a lot from your presentation too, so I appreciate that. I've got no slides, and I think that this is fairly in line with how I understand the narrative section to fit into the book. I think when I was first asked to be a part of this project, I was really excited, but I realized that I hadn't been a part of a project like this or seen a project like this exist where the voices of undergraduate students were prioritizing in people's narratives and experiences on the ground and actually going through the work themselves of figuring out their own racial identity was featured prominently. And I think this is starting to really have an impact on how I see change being made in this field, and that's what I'll talk a little bit about in this talk. So when you look through these narrative sections, something that I think is really interesting is these patterns start to pop out. People kind of begin their stories rooting themselves in their family history and their experience as children, and really exposing people in a really vulnerable and rich way to their personal lives. And I think, you know, the research methods and you know, very heavy articles that are really heavy on methodology and like bibliographies and all of this stuff, sometimes they lose a little bit of the touch of the personal, and people can't really see themselves as part of this story. When you start to root yourself in your family and your history, you kind of bring people along in a more intimate journey, and you can start to let the arc of these narratives goes from talking about people's families to where they first become aware of race, to where they first start to feel like there's something wrong, like they don't belong, there's something in their experience socially, their experience at school, their experience in their family that's telling them that there's something different and deviant. And then they start to find a space or group of people or vocabulary that helps them to define and contextualize their experience and start to feel like they belong somewhere. And then there is this this kind of exploration and digging into that. And one narrative in this in the book that I thought did a really good job of talking about that actually was E. Alexander talking about the Great Undoing. And I actually want to read a little piece from their section really quickly. As a Black American student in a therapeutic field, my time at MSI, which is a minority serving institution, the beginning of a lifelong journey, was one of great undoing. It was painful, scary, frustrating, confusing, and sometimes invalidating and lonely. And then they go down to say, I was forced to examine how I made sense of the world, related to and shared space with others, deconstructed knowledge and authority, engaged power, and so on. With time, I shifted into wanting to more deeply explore creation in with my non-Western cousins. What I think is really interesting about these narratives as well is it doesn't just take you on the journey of identity development and understand how people came to make sense of themselves racially, but also that once those spaces were provided and once that community existed and once that vocabulary and literature started to become something they were familiar with and exposed to, they contribute to the field in a great deal and dig down, and it has this exponential effect on the people around them and other people's ability to see themselves thriving in these spaces too. The point that I want to make there, and another thing that I realized, you know, especially through my narrative story, is that people's identities aren't static. They are constantly evolving and they're iterative, and sometimes we have to constantly go back to them and explore them and discover more and find new spaces. And I think what I took away from that is that telling your story and experience and people being able to read other people's stories helps you even no two multiracial people's stories are going to be the exact same, but at least you see people thinking through and struggling through their identities. It helps you to figure out where you can start. And uh, when I used to be the president of a multiracial student organization on campus at Northwestern, the vast majority of the work that I was doing in that space was, as much as I wanted to do like advocacy work and systems level change and all of this stuff, it was really holding space for students to have a chance to, really holding space for students to tell that story for the first time and have them feel safe in those spaces. And we did that with very limited resources. Once I was kind of ready to move past the conversation of, you know, who am I? What is my? What are my family's roots? What are the identities that I'm bringing to the table? I started thinking more critically about what kind of institutional support we could need to kind of take that conversation a little bit further, because students are the only ones who can take on the process of developing their own identity. But there's a lot of things that faculty, staff, administration can do to make sure that students have the tools to begin that exploration. And so one thing that I realized is I'd never read the narrative of multiracial student ever in a course that I took. And I studied sociology and minored in Black studies. And so to have gone through that entire process and never have read something like what I had written was pretty jarring. And so assign books that also have narrative within it, but also encourage students to dig into their own stories and write that for themselves, because that's the best way that students can explore that. And for staff too, I mean, when Mix was operating on campus, we had very little institutional support. We didn't know what to ask for because we didn't understand necessarily how we fit within the matrix of other monoracial organizations that were operating on campus. But I think if I had ever been told by a staff member or somebody who's working in the multiracial student spaces, that it was okay for your identity to change and it's okay for you to continue to explore that in different spaces. And they were familiar with student leaders of these different organizations who were able to make those introductions and help students to feel comfortable in those spaces too. It takes a lot of the lift off of students' shoulders as well. And then for administration, making sure that when you're setting, strategic goals for the university, you're not just thinking about how can we admit more racially diverse students, but how can we make sure that the campus is ready to receive them, and that no matter what they mark, racially or identity-wise as they're coming into the campus, that can shift and their needs can shift and their identities are not just kind of locked into that checkbox, and that there's a variety of ways of serving those types of students. And then also just thinking about publishers and editors too, and how they kind of contribute to this as well. The opportunity to contribute a narrative to something like this through Stylus was really important. I think I'd never seen narratives like this, but also within the narrative section, there are people like Nalia who incorporate tools like poetry that help to, when you don't explicitly see yourselves in these spaces and there's something else that you can, another way that you can absorb meaning and relate to these stories and help relate that to your life. I think that things like poetry and narrative can be much more dynamic, especially when you're thinking about, what are undergraduates reading and are they seeing themselves in it? But then another theme that you see throughout these narrative spaces is, or through these narratives within the book, is how important spaces like this space that we're in right now are, but also student organizations like Mixed Roots, Critical Mixed Race Studies Conference, and even other conferences that might not explicitly make space for something like this, but where folks have decided they're gonna go and try to, like NCORE, like ACPA, routinely these convening spaces end up being a place where people are able to discuss their identity, be affirmed in their identity, and really find community. And so that's my 10 minutes there, but I hope that that's helpful, and I hope that that kind of emphasizes the importance of putting narrative towards the front in this type of research.
Great. I believe we're moving on to the third section of the book, which is strategies and tools for enhancing multiracial inclusion. There's a listing of the chapters, and there is a model presented as the front part of that part of the book, and it was authored by Chelsea and Mark, and I'm going to turn that over to Chelsea to take over the next few minutes to walk us through that model and the impact of it for campus change efforts.
All right, good morning. Thanks everyone. And I'm just so grateful to be able to be part of this project and for the space that's being created increasingly to explore multiracial experiences and voices in higher education and other types of organizations as well. And so this is a model that Mark and I developed, and it's, I guess, about 10 years ago, and it's evolved since then. And so this is a new model, a new iteration that we're calling for now. We're calling the Contextualizing Multiraciality in Campus Climate model. And I really believe theory is best read. And so I don't want to bog us down in a lot of that discussion, but I do want to highlight some of the key concepts here in the model, and I also want to recognize that this chapter is many of the chapters. What I appreciate so much about this book is that there's so much vulnerability and narrative, story, personal voice in it, and this is one of the chapters where that's not so much present, and so I want to make it a little bit more alive and tell you a little bit more about the process and where this came from, rather than getting into the specifics of all of the theories. And so I came into I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to have gotten to go to graduate school, where I got to actually read one of Charmaine's books, my first quarter as a master's student on racial identity. And she had a chapter in there on multiracial identity. And that was my first time. I went, oh my gosh, hey, I'm reading something that resonates with my own story. And a lot of my interest in pursuing graduate work had to do with what I now have the language to describe as having experienced a hostile racial climate in undergrad, and even looking back in K-12, and just navigating different social identity groups and that liminal space in between, and not being whatever enough of color, and then being tokenized or excused by white folks is being said, oh well, you're not really like them, and just all these racial microaggressions that we experience interpersonally, and then also these macroaggressions that can happen on institutional levels and at the system level. And so the impetus for developing this model really came from my just tenacious desire to make sense of experiences that I had and family members had, and then my other people who identified multiracially in college and in graduate school, just trying to put together different pieces of things that we had experienced and that other scholars who had come before us had begun to name. So what you'll see here is just a representation of a lot of research that has, been done for many decades now, and trying to create more of an ecological model to help us kind of contextualize ourselves or our students or the work that we're doing, or whatever the it is, and specifically in higher education. But I think this can apply and definitely in K-12, and I'm really interested in the application of models such as this and other types of organizations and systems. And so you'll see kind of in that outer ring, just the acknowledgement by many scholars that that there are these more distal forces but they don't only exist outside of the university or college setting, but it's all, we're not in a vacuum. Everything is very fluid, moving in and out. And so we wanted to really highlight racial formation processes and racism, because in campus climate research, a lot of times the experiences were highlighted, but there wasn't always an explicit, and oftentimes there was not an explicit tie at the time to racism. And so in campus climate models, one that I was really fortunate to help develop with Dr. Silvia Hurtado at UCLA about 10 years ago now, brought in the local community as well as the family context of students, and what is the relationship, and what are the relationships between the institution and the community that it's located in, and also what are the family contexts that students bring. And we know that from identity development work that our families are really important spheres of influence and socialization for us. Then we have the campus climate dimensions, and there's 5 of them. This draws upon the work of Dr. Jeffrey Milam and others, as well as Dr. Silvia Hurtado, and a lot of them are at the institutional level. So we think about compositional diversity, that's numbers and admits, which Nick was saying, we can't stop there. And then it's also looking at the historical legacy of inclusion, exclusion of an institution, and the organizational dimension, which is where you're going to see things like policies and budget allocation, what the curriculum does and does not contain, so on and so forth. And then there are interpersonal dimensions, which are psychological and behavioral, and those really are intertwined. But it's kind of what are in people's minds, what are the racial frames that we've developed, what are the attitudes and biases that we hold, how do those come out in our behavioral interactions with one another. So it's a super quick overview of the campus climate work, really spearheaded by Silvia Hurtado and Jeffrey Milam and others. And then in the middle, not quite the center, but in the middle, we're calling it pieces of a pie. And these are concepts from multiracial scholarship and racial equity work and scholarship in general. And so we have here monoracism, which was talked about earlier. Max talked a little bit about it earlier, and there's a great chapter in the book. I really just want to extend my gratitude to scholars who are willing to, and I guess I'm now in that, I'm in that camp of, these are not concepts that are greeted with open arms a lot of times. And I know that Charmaine will talk in the end, and she'll probably talk about this, but there's a lot of resistance to these ideas, and it can be very painful as we experience monoracism and multiracial microaggressions in our daily lives, and then engaging intentionally in scholarship or professional work that also leaves us very vulnerable, but also can be a great source of energy and passion. And so, there's other things here, interest convergence, that comes from critical race theory, the fluidity of peer culture and group boundaries, that comes from Kristen Wren's work on multiracial identity, and backgrounds and appearance, what people look like and what our cultural knowledge and ability to navigate different cultural contexts are. And then, the racial categorization, and specifically the racial ascription of identity that can really trigger multiracial microaggressions and exclusion for people who may identify multiracially. So lastly, we have student equity and student outcomes in the center. And that was kind of, this driving, okay, but why? Why is this important on a bigger macro societal level? And the model that I got to develop with Silvia Hurtado and others on campus climate was able to finally link research on student of color's experiences of the campus climate, which had been linked to increasing their sense of belonging. But now there's enough of a body of research that shows it actually impacts additional student outcomes, retention, academic outcomes, all different kinds of outcomes. And so the goal is to just really remember what we want to see. We want to reconnect to this community and societal transformation when we're engaging in whatever work that we're doing within an institution, really bringing it back to the community and helping ourselves and others be part of the change that we want to see. Not to be totally cliche. So that's kind of the why behind it. If you can go to the next slide, I've got a little bit of time left. I was going to try not to spend a ton of time there, but I did. The next section of our chapter, I just offer some starter questions by job type, and there are limitations to a chapter. So there are not questions for student leaders. There are not questions for community organizers and activists, but I think that the kinds of questions that are here are ones that can be used by anyone in any role. They're not necessarily limited to specific positions within a university. So the hope was to kind of take the model and just say, okay, here's some starting points. Here is a place to, just start asking questions for yourself and for those that you work with, or those who, if you're students, maybe you also live with, and so on and so forth, and figure out, how can we start moving things forward from where they are. And I know I'm pretty much out of time, so I have one last slide. And I think, the other presenters have really touched on this, and I think the book does a beautiful job of this, but really starting from the inside out. And this is not part of the chapter, but these are some questions that I think are important if we want to really engage in praxis. And I found that, unfortunately, depending on your institution and the culture of it, and what the expectations are for administrators and leaders, there's not often a value placed on the praxis and the reflection that's necessary for this work. And so I just want to offer these very basic questions to you to just take some time today, tomorrow, the weekend, and take time to reflect on yourself and how full your bucket is and your positionalities, both socially and within your institution. Thinking about if you have a team, and that's super important to have people to work with, and to think about what is already happening on your campus, because we might be really passionate, excited about this thing that's super important to us, but how do we continue to link it to broader efforts in diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice? So I know I'm out of time, but hopefully this will get you interested in, if you haven't read the book already, get you interested in it. And there's some amazing resources in this section of the book for folks who are wanting to lead retreats and student affairs professionals. And so as well as for faculty who are interested in learning about creating like critical mixed race studies space for that on their campus. So I'm going to turn it back over to Charmaine or Marc, and thank you all for being here today.
Great, thank you so much, Chelsea. And so then those were the 3 sections, and we had these representative chapters. Thank you again. We end the book with this final chapter that it really is, Charmaine mentioned at the beginning about this, the whole book being an intergenerational conversation, but we focused on one chapter of reflect on the book as a whole. We brought in an emerging scholar, Lisa Combs, or Lisa De La Cruz Combs, who is a doctoral student at Ohio State. One of my advisees. So we brought her in, and we were able to reread the chapters, bring in our own narratives again, and really reflect on both the strengths of the book overall, but also what are some weaknesses, right? And some emerging issues that really weren't all that addressed. And so colorism was one of them, right? That was mentioned in the chat. Like, yeah, we're focusing on monoracism because that hasn't necessarily been focused on or a topic or theorized fully for what it looks like. But yeah, then we're missing out on how does it interact with colorism, transracial adoptees, so these gaps, what are these gaps in the book that weren't necessarily addressed, and how can we think about it moving forward? We also spoke about some of the resistance we felt when we try to talk about these topics. What is our role within larger efforts towards racial justice and equity, and just ending with this sense of like, it's really complex. And how do we embrace that? How do we really think through that and use that maybe to our advantage to get people to think differently about the monoracialized categories that people sometimes are really holding on to? Yes, probably for good reason when we think about the longer legacy that Max talked about in terms of the context and where we're situating ourselves now. And so it does think about this sense of, well, what's next? What are the future directions? And so I do think there's some questions and some things in the chat that will help us to also address some of these things. But when we think about the book as a whole and the scope, and where we're leading with this future directions, we invite everybody to continue to engage in this community, in this conversation, push back. We need good work in this area to kind of keep our thinking moving forward so that we can all be better together, right? But don't ignore multiraciality. That's not the answer, right? So how do we engage it more fully so that we just can learn from and with each other moving forward? And so I will end it there and open it up to questions and a larger discussion.
Mark, before we do that, Mark, I'm not sure if people can hear me.
Yes.
I know that one of the emerging issues was DNA testing, and I know you've written about that, and Lisa mentioned it in there. Could you just take a minute to say how that's an emerging issue and how that is influenced, the work on multiracial identity and multiracial making change on campuses? Just if you can say that in a nutshell or so.
Yes, that's great. So yeah, that is an emerging issue. I think that it speaks to some of the questions that have been even asked. There is the 2020 census data showed a very large change in who would be considered the multiracial or multi-ethnic population between 2010 and 2020. So it was like maybe 246% increase, like the most increase. And so a lot of that has to do with the data collection, but there is an NPR story. So thanks, Paul, for putting that in the chat. There's a different NPR story that came out a little earlier that they think a lot of it has to do with the increase in DNA testing, and that people who report out that they have multiple, their ancestry is traced to these different regions, they are now maybe checking multiple boxes they didn't do before they took the test. I don't know if that's somewhat anecdotal. I think I've heard that too. We see it in higher ed, especially with people trying to, claim different things at different times and what they might be able to get out of them, scholarships, things like that. So it is definitely something we need to engage more fully. And I have some colleagues at Westchester University, Guillermo-Wann, and doing this DNA diversity project along with Anita Foman, who's been doing it for the longest time now. So I do recommend looking into some of that work if you're interested in engaging it more fully. So I think that's a great way to segue into larger Q&A. And we invite this to be more of a conversation. We'll try to go through some of the questions that have been asked, but please use the chat. If you have resources to share as well, yeah, we can do that. And we'll try to go through the chat and answer any questions. And I'll also open it up to other panelists if you want to respond to anything anybody else said or have questions to pose to the group. We will do that for the next few minutes.
Sure. I'm going to suggest, Mark, that we do maybe 2 questions, and then because I think Patty may want to do some stylist business right before we the end of the hour, and then we can hang out for the next 15 minutes after Patty concludes and take the additional questions. I know I saw one before we go to the Q&A box. One popped up in the chat box about monoracial spaces, like sororities and cultural centers, and how to perhaps diversify. How should we address multiracial students in those spaces? And I know folks have a lot of experience about that, so I'm going to throw that to some of the panelists, and then I'm going to start scanning the Q&A box. So let's start with anyone who wants to address multiracial experiences in monoracial spaces like cultural centers, fraternities, and sororities.
I'd be happy to start. Although my experience as an undergrad and graduate student is becoming a little more distant. So I don't want to, I would love to hear from other panelists who are there now, but I think, you know, the extent to which, so Kristen Wren's work on multiracial identity really talks about the fluidity of peer group and the group boundaries. And there's some work that comes from sociology on that as well. And so I think ideally monoracial spaces would be fluid and welcoming spaces for students who identify multiracially. But there's a lot that can be contested in those spaces. And unfortunately they have been for many, but not all multiracial people, places of exclusion and rejection, of not being whatever enough. So I think, you know, I think that this book is a place to kind of explore how can we engage with our monoracial communities and student organizations, and really work through some of those hard issues, and why might people be suspicious of, you know, multiracial people joining those spaces. But it's really hard work, but I think necessary to create inclusive communities. So I don't know if folks want to add on to that.
Yeah, I'll add, you know, I think that how I got involved in doing this kind of research and work around race and racism is very much what Chelsea was referring to, like as an undergrad, experiencing those kinds of very sharp racial boundaries or racial or ethnic boundaries within groups. And I think that in terms of like praxis, like trying to take this and then turn it into something like on campus, like I think, as I mentioned, I'm a PhD student, but I still work in the Division of Student Affairs. And I have always envisioned where when we do all those trainings with like student orgs at the beginning of the year, that we did one where we engage with like those racial and ethnic groups, where we talk about like the social construction of race and the ways in which those groups have power to be able to shape racial norms, and how have power to shape who can and cannot engage with that space. So I think that would be a really cool workshop to do with student leaders, is to talk about and engage with them on these ideas. Yeah.
I know there was a question, Nick, unless you wanted to weigh in on that, I'll move to the next. You're good? I sort of erased part of this question inadvertently, but there was a question I think that talked about folks whose ancestry does not include white folks. Mark, can you see that question? It was the first one that was posted. Somehow it disappeared off of my screen, but I believe it talks about the differences in experiences that people might have as multiracial people on campuses. It's in the Q&A box for folks who are not white and something else, but of multiple heritages that are targeted by race. Do you see that question, Mark? Am I?
Yeah, I answered it. It goes into the answer block in the Q&A. But yeah, I didn't see that as necessarily a question.
Okay.
The question was around the reporting, or trying to lobby people or the DOE to change its reporting collecting. But that was an assertion that I think I would agree with. Other people might agree that there is more erasure of people who are not mixed with white in data collection efforts, and how institutions sort of capture and serve students, that those students will tend to be erased more than others who have white ancestry. So I don't know, are there or Chelsea, go ahead.
Sure, I really appreciate this question, and I am someone who does have white ancestry, and also Mexican and Filipino. And so I came across a book by Paul Spicard and others out of UC Santa Barbara that is about decentering whiteness in mixed race studies. And so I just wanted to offer that as another resource for folks, because it's a really important, it's an important piece of this work that that I think has not held the same space. And so we want to tend to folks who have various racial backgrounds, because all of our experiences are unique and some are in common. And so it's important that that we continue to be inclusive and be part of trying to decenter whiteness in our work.
I saw that Jared Willis had dropped something into Q&A about the primary ethnicity, the whole idea of hierarchy of racial categories, and I think it ties into colors at some point, and we have to be mindful as multiracial people or people working with multiracial people on campus, how much we have been affected by the centuries of racism, that how much we reinforce a hierarchy of who is and who is not multiracial. I'm going to suggest we go, Mark, to the question that Warren said, asked about strategies for addressing, it's disappeared again. I don't know if people are answering this somehow.
Yeah, I'm trying to answer because I don't think we're going to get to all of them.
Okay,
So,
a quick hit about countering the efforts to erase discussions about race, gender identity, sexual orientation on campus. We'll do that one maybe quickly if anyone has a strategy, and then we'll go to, and then we'll see what else we can get to in the next few minutes that we have.
I can go again. This actually reminds me of some of my more recent professional work in K-12. And I just think that partnering with community grassroots-based activist organizations is important for people in the system. And that can be really challenging, especially as people of color in the system. But I think that is an important strategy. If I'm understanding the question right, that this is really a political, wanting to counter the censorship, the political censorship and banning of materials in schools. And so I think it's, again, speaks to the importance of praxis and building coalitions across and within and between different groups and organizations who are engaged in that work. I'm reminded of some work that's being done by Nolan Cabrera out of Arizona in the work of ethnic studies in K-12 education. And so that could be a place, I'm not remembering his center's name, but if you Google him, you can find Nolan Cabrera and Arizona, and that could be a good resource as well.
I'm going to ask Patty maybe to jump back in quickly, and then we will hang out for those folks who have another 15 minutes or so to go back to the questions after Patty does some housekeeping things for Silas.
All right, thank you to all of our authors for sharing their time and presenting with us today. And thank you to everyone who tuned in live with us this afternoon on Zoom. If you are interested in ordering the second edition of Multiracial Experiences in Higher Education, use code MRE20 to get 20% off the book and free shipping from Stylus. I will share the link and code in the chat bar. The webinar video replay will be available tomorrow and shared on all of our Stylus social media feeds. Also visit our Stylus webinar calendar online to check out our upcoming spring webinar events. If you have any feedback on this webinar or any requests for future webinars, please feel free to email us directly at stylusinfo@styluspub.com. We will post the transcript and chat dialogue. I will attach those to the book page as well after we do a quick cleanup. So that way we have everyone's spellings and dialogue correct without the typos. I will also stay on through the Q&A session. So that way any transcript will also be included. So I won't stop that recording. All right, so I will pass it back over to you guys.
I know there's a long question from Warren in the Q&A that says, as an Ashkenazi Jew, I often feel I am placed into a racialized interspace, depending on the place between racialized BIPOC people and white. On the East and West Coast, in my in my environments. I'm categorized as white, while in my teaching in Iowa, many of my conservative Christian white students constructed me as a non-white. And when I travel to Eastern Europe, I'm certainly constructed as non-white. Does your book discuss the hinterlands, the interspace of racial categorization?
I'll jump on very quickly on that and say that I think that was what was unique about the definition of monoracism that I shared, is that monoracism is this thing that can be experienced by monoracial people and also by mixed race people, and it can be perpetuated by mixed race people and by monoracial people, and it's being racialized or things that are racialized as racially impure or non-white or mixed, not, mixed in some way. And so I do think that, when you're talking about this identity, right, in particular, or being Ashkenazi Jewish, and I will say that I'm not Jewish myself, and so I'm not the expert on that, on the politics of that particular identity. But I do think that that theme is kind of what you're describing, right? Of being racialized in different contexts and arguably for different needs, right? So I think Chelsea, mentioned differential racialization as a theory within the model. And I think looking at that work might also give you some sense of how identities can be socially constructed with particular purposes in mind. So.
Yes, I just wanted to say that there's a piece in the chapter that Marc and I co-authored that starts to get at this. And this is an experience that I have. And so it was important for me. We didn't go deep into it. So there's some space for sure, academically and in practice to do that. But I do, from, I can be in one room and from one person perceives me as white, another person perceives me as a person of color, another person perceives me as racially ambiguous, all within like a 5-minute experience. But I also definitely recognize it moving between different regions or even just different spaces within, say, Southern California. So I appreciate that question, and I just want to affirm that that experience and that it is a common one. Depending on how we present physically. And so room for more work to be done there. But yes, we do start to get at that.
Yeah, and I think that was really well put. And the last thing, this is just all reminding me that all like these racial categories and monoracism and all of this is really rooted in white supremacy and your relationship to whiteness, and whether or not you fit squarely into one of these boxes also has a lot to do with like why the purpose of why they set up these racial categories, and in also in relationship to these different racial groups is like placed within like a capitalistic structure as well. And I think this kind of goes back to the question about like how to get monoracial spaces to be more inclusive of multiracial people. One thing that I was thinking, especially when I see spaces like fraternities mentioned in there, is especially when you're talking about white fraternities, that these spaces were designed very much in a specific way to uphold a certain legacy of white supremacy, and that history needs to be acknowledged in order for change to really be made on college campuses as well. A lot of the harm that I saw students around me experiencing when I was in undergrad was trying to contort themselves and contort their identities to fit in these white spaces, and kind of, like really, really hoping and like fighting for acceptance within them when that's just not how they were designed. And I think that is also a conversation to be had on college campuses as well. With Black fraternities, I think there's a different conversation to be had there, but that's just a thought too.
Is there a question, Marc, that you want to pull out for the last few minutes that we have here?
No, but I had something else to share that somebody brought up. Two things: the contextualization and sort of the grounding and thinking about the previous and where we are now, and just we're kind of like very based in what we know now. Even the census kind of feels like all this increase. It reminded me of a recent or a CMRS, a critical mixed race studies talk or panel featuring Daniel McNeil, who's a historian, and he was talking about our need to rephrase the sort of where are you from question to also include when are you from, because of that sort of sense of time, and even in our intergenerational conversations, like how we answer the questions about identity or any of this is so attached to how we've been socialized to think about it all, and that looks different across time. So I just wanted to share that. And then when Nick was mentioning the student organizations and how many other ones, we see this as a common practice, they're institutionalized, maybe not like fully, but like they have dedicated staff advisors that help with their transition, right? Like they have dedicated resources in multicultural centers or multicultural affairs offices. And so that's really hard for new groups and mixed groups in particular, who are sort of like have to navigate some of that. And we see high turnover with a lot of those groups because they don't have the same sort of like dedicated support and institute. And I know not all groups have that, but it's much more common to see among particular groups, and it's hard to kind of navigate some of that. So just wanted to share some things. Thanks.
Absolutely. And I think that, Mark, I just want to piggyback on what you said about the passage of time. And that is evident, I think, throughout the book, of the generational aspect of both knowledge, how we look at it, and also people's experiences. I know that you and I were on a Student Affairs Now podcast in October. I think it's episode number 65, because I just sent it to someone, where that was also discussed in terms of my being born and raised and growing up in the 60s and 70s is different from an experience of someone like Mark, who's a few years younger than I am, and also who's so very vastly different from students and even faculty and staff who are on campuses now. So as the literature evolves and the themes evolve, we have to be mindful that some foundational literature may still be relevant, but it has to be tweaked in order to make up for the time in which it was written and researched. It may still be relevant, but Bailey Jackson gave me this image of a snapshot of a moving picture when we discuss any of these concepts, whether it's race, gender identity, sexual orientation, that we're capturing something in the moment in a certain political, cultural, and context, social context, and that will always be changing. And so there's always room, and we welcome the voices yet to come researching this topic, because we know future research and future models and future practice is going to reflect something different, because society and culture and norms are always changing. So there's always space for new voices. I think in the last couple of minutes, I'm going to pass it back to the panelists and see if you want to offer a closing thought. And with that, we'll end after you finish speaking. So.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to say I'm really thankful to be able to have this space. I was, kind of thinking about that, in the spirit of like time and where we're situated within time. I think it's really there's so many different challenging things about race and racism that are being navigated within scholarship and within practice and within society. But I am very grateful to be able to have spaces like this where we can engage with those kinds of ideas and try and push our contemporary understandings and futures around these issues. So I'm really glad to be in community with you all today.
Yeah, I would definitely echo that. I really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation. And I think any work we can do to kind of, continue to complicate these issues and deepen our understanding of them, and come up with solutions and hold space for each other's stories and narratives are really critical to pushing this work along. So I'm really grateful that we're able to hold this space.
Gratitude. As has been said, and I think for me, even just reading the other chapters in the book, you know, reminds me that our identity and our it continues to evolve. So even after reading the book, I realized, oh, I'm more Mexipina and white than I am Mexican, Filipino and white. You know, here I'm in my 40s. You know, so it's just a gift to be able to connect with folks, and I just appreciate people's again, vulnerability, I think. And the other closing thought I would say is just to remember, as I think you know, Max opened with, is that that engaging in the work and even doing our own internal work can involve some trauma. And so just important to take care of ourselves, take care of yourself, to take care of one another. You know, be kind to yourself, be kind to one another, and generous. And I think that, you know, that also carries, that spirit will carry us well as we go about this work. So thank you again so much, everyone, for being here, and thank you to my fellow panelists.
And my closing remark is to add appreciation to all of you and to all the contributors, and particularly to Marc, who was a fabulous co-editor, and I've learned so much from his work and his mentoring of the scholars who are yet to come. So I'll leave it to that.
Oh yeah, no, you don't need to acknowledge me, Charmaine. You led this all. I learned so much from you. People talking about they heard you speak 30 years ago. I'm like, that's awesome. So thank you for yeah, the generous accolades. But you really did help model for me what good co-editing and convening of this community could look like, that I'm hoping to continue to mentor and model others. And so thank you. Thanks everybody, Max, Nick, and Chelsea, just for being here and sharing their stories, and, you know, just making me think even there's so much more to, you know, pursue and consider. So thank you. And thanks to all the contributors and participants of the webinar and stylists.
Thank you everybody for being here today. You will receive links for the book as for the webinar replay following the closing of the Zoom. We want to thank you all so much for coming here and supporting our Stylist webinar series. And if there are no other questions, I will close it out for today. All right, thank you everybody. Also, because there were a lot of questions, we will share the transcript and chat, and have a wonderful, wonderful day.